On March 15, 1943, Sergeant Arthur "Red" Smith crawled under the cowling of a P-38 Lightning at Port Moresby airstrip, New Guinea, listening to pilots argue about another mission they might not survive. 28 years old, farm mechanic from Iowa, 0 engineering degrees. The squadron had lost 23 aircraft in 8 weeks. Japanese Zeros were killing American pilots at 28,000 feet where P-38 engines choked on thin air. Smith's job was simple. Maintain the aircraft exactly as Lockheed designed them. Follow every specification in the technical manual. Never deviate from factory settings. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to Japanese air superiority. Twin-engine fighter, 37-foot wingspan, distinctive twin-boom design. But at high altitude, the Allison V-1710 engines lost power. Pilots called them flying coffins because Zeros could outclimb them every time. Smith had watched mechanics follow regulations while pilots died. 3 days earlier, he'd buried a friend whose P-38 couldn't generate enough power to escape a Zero at 30,000 feet. That night, Smith made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. He was going to modify the engine boost pressure beyond what Lockheed, the Army Air Forces, and every engineering manual said was safe. If this story about how one mechanic's illegal modification changed the Pacific Air War moves you, please hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories like this every day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let us know you're here, because these heroes deserve to be remembered. Now, back to Smith and the modification that shouldn't have worked. By dawn, Smith had adjusted the supercharger waste gate on 6 P-38s, increased manifold pressure from 54 inches of mercury to 60. Each engine now produced 1,600 horsepower instead of 1,425. That's 175 extra horses per engine, 350 per aircraft. Enough power to climb faster, turn tighter, chase Zeros into the stratosphere. But there were problems every engineer at Lockheed would have screamed about. Higher boost pressure meant higher combustion temperatures. The Allison engines were already running hot. Push them harder and cylinder heads could crack. Pistons could seize. Connecting rods could snap and punch through the crankcase, sending metal fragments through the cowling at 400 miles per hour. If an engine failed at 30,000 feet over enemy territory, the pilot had 2 choices. Nurse one engine back to base or bail out over Japanese-held jungle. Neither option was good. Smith had done the math. At 60 inches of mercury, engine temperatures would reach 280 degrees Celsius. Factory limit was 260. He was betting that brief combat bursts wouldn't sustain high temperatures long enough to cause catastrophic failure. He was betting pilot lives on calculations scribbled on the back of a maintenance log. The idea had come to Smith 6 weeks earlier while reading a captured Japanese technical report. Allied intelligence had analyzed a downed Zero and discovered its Nakajima Sakai engine used overboost injection for combat situations. Short bursts of increased power when pilots needed it most. The Japanese weren't afraid to push their engines past normal limits for 30-second intervals. Why were Americans? Smith found a sympathetic ear in Lieutenant James Davis, a P-38 pilot who'd survived 3 encounters with Zeros by pure luck. Davis had watched his wingman die because his Lightning couldn't climb fast enough. When Smith explained his modification, Davis didn't hesitate. "Do it to my aircraft. If it works, we'll spread the word. If it kills me, at least I went down trying something new." Smith worked on Davis's P-38 for 3 nights. The technical challenge wasn't just boost pressure. He had to recalibrate the fuel mixture to prevent detonation. Lean fuel caused pre-ignition. Rich fuel wasted power. He settled on a 13:1 air-fuel ratio, richer than factory specification but necessary for the increased temperatures. He also modified the intercooler ducting to improve airflow. The P-38's intercoolers sat in the wing leading edges, designed to cool compressed air from the superchargers before it entered the cylinders. Factory ducting was adequate for standard boost levels but insufficient for Smith's modification. He cut new air scoops from salvaged aluminum, enlarged the intake areas by 40%, installed them himself using rivets and sealant meant for fuel tanks. On March 18th, Davis took off for a test flight. Smith stood on the tarmac, watching the Lightning climb. At 10,000 feet, Davis radioed back. "Red, this thing is pulling like a freight train. I'm climbing 500 feet per minute faster than normal." At 25,000 feet, the real test began. Davis pushed both throttles to maximum, activating Smith's modification for the first time under combat conditions. The engine screamed. Manifold pressure hit 60 inches. Davis reported oil temperatures rising but staying within acceptable range. At 32,000 feet, higher than any P-38 in the squadron had ever climbed, Davis leveled off. "Red, you just made this Lightning grow teeth. When can you do this to the rest of the squadron?" Smith said nothing, just grinned and started walking toward the next aircraft. But there was a problem neither man had considered. Someone had been listening to their radio conversation. Someone who didn't appreciate unauthorized modifications to multi-million-dollar military aircraft. By that evening, Smith would be standing in front of his commanding officer, facing charges that could end with a court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. The modification worked. Now he had to survive the consequences of success. Captain Robert Henderson summoned Smith to operations headquarters at 1900 hours. Henderson was old Army, 46 years old, career officer who believed regulations existed for good reasons. He stood behind his desk, holding Smith's maintenance log, face carved from granite. "Sergeant, did you modify 6 P-38 engines without authorization?" Smith stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that unauthorized modifications to military aircraft constitute a violation of Article 92? Failure to obey a lawful order?" "Yes, sir." Henderson set down the log, looked at Smith like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Lieutenant Davis says his aircraft now climbs 30% faster. Says it feels like a completely different machine. He wants his entire flight modified. So do 4 other pilots who heard about it." Smith said nothing. Henderson continued. "The problem is, if your modification causes engine failure and kills a pilot, I'm responsible. If it works and we start winning dogfights, some engineering officer at Wright Field will want to know why we're ignoring Lockheed specifications. Either way, this ends badly for both of us." The silence stretched. Then Henderson did something unexpected. He pulled out a mission report from the previous week. 3 P-38s lost to zeros. All at high altitude. All because American fighters couldn't generate enough power to fight back. "I lost good men because our aircraft can't do the job we're asking them to do. If your modification gives them a fighting chance, I'm willing to look the other way. But if one engine fails because of your adjustments, I will personally see you court-martialed." "Understood." Smith nodded. "Understood, sir." Henderson dismissed him. Smith walked back to the flight line, knowing he'd just been given permission to continue, but only if nothing went wrong. The margin for error had disappeared. Over the next 2 weeks, Smith modified 18 more P-38s. He trained 3 other mechanics in the procedure, turned it into a systematic process that could be completed in 4 hours per aircraft. Each modification followed the same pattern. Increase boost pressure to 60 inches, enrich fuel mixture to 13:1, enlarge intercooler ducting, recalibrate throttle response. The pilots noticed immediately. Climb rates increased. Top speed at altitude improved by 15 miles per hour. But the real advantage showed up on March 29th during a mission overlay. 8 P-38s from the 475th Fighter Group encountered 12 zeros at 27,000 feet. Before Smith's modifications, American pilots would have struggled to maintain altitude while zeros climbed above them. This time was different. Lieutenant Davis pushed his throttles forward, felt the modified engines respond with power he'd never experienced. His P-38 climbed through 28,000 feet, 29,000, 30,000. The zeros tried to follow but couldn't match his rate of climb. Davis rolled inverted, dove on a zero from above, fired a burst that tore through the Japanese fighter's wing root. First kill for a Smith-modified P-38. The battle lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, 5 zeros were falling toward the jungle below. 2 P-38s had minor damage. 0 losses for the Americans. Word spread through Port Moresby like wildfire. Pilots started requesting Smith's modification. Mechanics from other squadrons asked for technical details. Within a month, 40 P-38s had been modified. The 475th Fighter Group's kill ratio jumped from 2-1 to 7-1 virtually overnight. But success brought attention. On April 15th, a technical inspection team from the 5th Air Force arrived at Port Moresby. 3 engineering officers, 2 Lockheed representatives, all carrying clipboards and regulations. They'd heard rumors about unauthorized engine modifications. They were there to investigate, and they had authority to ground the entire squadron if they found violations. Smith's rebellion was about to face its biggest test, and this time Captain Henderson might not be able to protect him. The inspection team started with Davis's P-38, the first aircraft Smith had modified. Major William Patterson, Chief Engineering Officer from 5th Air Force Headquarters, removed the cowling and immediately saw the enlarged intercooler scoops. These aren't factory components. Who authorized this modification? Silence. Patterson moved to the engine controls, checked the boost pressure settings, found the wastegate adjusted beyond specifications. This aircraft is operating at 60 inches of mercury. Lockheed's maximum authorized pressure is 54 inches. That's a 10% overpressure that could cause catastrophic engine failure. He turned to Henderson. Captain, I'm grounding this aircraft and every other P-38 that's been modified. Effective immediately. Henderson stepped forward. Major, with respect, these modifications have resulted in 5 confirmed aerial victories in the past 2 weeks with 0 mechanical failures. Patterson wasn't listening. I don't care if they shot down Yamamoto himself. Unauthorized modifications violate every safety protocol we have. If one of these engines fails and kills a pilot, you'll be explaining it to a board of inquiry. That's when Lieutenant Davis spoke up. Major, may I say something? Patterson glanced at him. This is a technical matter, Lieutenant, not a tactical discussion. Davis ignored the dismissal. 2 months ago, I watched my wingman die because his P-38 couldn't climb fast enough to escape a 0. Last week, I shot down 2 zeros because Sergeant Smith's modification gave my aircraft the power it needed to fight back. You can ground us if you want, but you'll be sending pilots back into combat with one hand tied behind their backs. The Major's expression didn't change. The regulations exist to keep you alive, Lieutenant, not to make you feel powerful. Then why are more of us surviving now than before the modifications? The question hung in the air. Patterson had no answer because the data supported Davis. Since Smith's modifications began, the 475th Fighter Group had lost only 2 aircraft in combat, both to ground fire. Before the modifications, they were losing 3 aircraft per week to zeros. Patterson conferred with the Lockheed representatives. One of them, an engineer named Robert Grifford, asked to speak with Smith. They talked for an hour in a maintenance hangar while the rest of the inspection team waited. Grifford wanted technical details: boost pressure settings, fuel mixture ratios, intercooler modifications, temperature limits. Smith explained everything, showed his calculations, demonstrated the modification process. When they finished, Grifford returned to Patterson and said something that changed everything. Major, from an engineering perspective, this modification is sound. The increased boost pressure is within the engine's mechanical tolerance as long as pilots limit high-power operation to combat situations. The intercooler improvements actually enhance engine longevity by reducing thermal stress. Patterson stared at him. Are you telling me an aircraft mechanic with no engineering degree figured out how to improve Lockheed's design? I'm telling you he found a practical solution to a combat problem that we missed in the laboratory. The inspection team didn't approve Smith's modifications officially. That would have required admitting that factory specifications were inadequate. Instead, they issued a memo stating that field adjustments for combat operations in tropical environments were acceptable as long as engine temperatures remained within safe parameters. It was bureaucratic language that meant the modifications could continue without officially authorizing them. Patterson pulled Smith aside before leaving. You're either very smart or very lucky, Sergeant. Maybe both. But if one of these engines fails, this memo won't protect you. Smith understood. He was still walking a tightrope. Success kept him out of prison, but one failure would destroy everything. He went back to work, knowing that 40 pilots were flying with engines he'd modified, trusting their lives to calculations he'd made in a maintenance tent at 2 a.m. The weight of that responsibility would have crushed most men, but Smith wasn't most men. He'd already decided that saving lives was worth risking his career. Now he just had to make sure the engines held together long enough to prove it. By June 1943, word of Smith's modifications had spread to every P-38 squadron in the Pacific. Mechanics from the 49th Fighter Group, the 8th Fighter Group, even Marine Corps units were requesting technical details. Smith received letters from pilots he'd never met, thanking him for giving them a fighting chance. But with success came escalation. Japanese pilots noticed that American P-38s were performing differently. Where Zeros once dominated at high altitude, now Lightnings climbed faster, turned tighter, fought with aggression that hadn't existed before. Japanese intelligence reports from mid-1943 noted that American twin-engine fighters exhibit improved performance characteristics inconsistent with known specifications. They adjusted tactics, started avoiding high-altitude engagements where modified P-38s had the advantage. On July 10th, Smith's modifications faced their ultimate test. The 475th Fighter Group received orders to escort B-25 bombers attacking WWII airfield, 400 miles north of Port Moresby. Intelligence predicted heavy Japanese fighter resistance, 30 Zeros defending the target. The Americans would bring 12 P-38s, all with Smith's modifications. Lieutenant Davis led the escort. At 28,000 feet over WWII, the Zeros appeared exactly as predicted. They climbed to intercept, expecting to use altitude advantage like they always had. Davis pushed his throttles to maximum. The modified engines responded instantly. His P-38 climbed through 30,000 feet while Zero struggled to keep pace. He rolled inverted. Dove on the lead Zero fired. The Japanese fighter exploded. Behind him, 11 other P-38s dove into the fight with power they'd never had before. The dogfight lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, 9 Zeros were confirmed destroyed. Another 4 were damaged and trailing smoke. The B-25s hit their target without losing a single bomber. The P-38s returned to Port Moresby with minor battle damage and 0 losses. That evening, General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, arrived at Port Moresby. He wanted to meet the mechanic who'd turned his P-38 squadrons into the most effective fighter units in the Pacific. Kenny found Smith in a maintenance tent, working on another engine modification. "Sergeant, I've heard impressive things about your work." Smith stood, wiped grease from his hands. "Just trying to help, sir." Kenny smiled. "You've done more than help. You've changed how we fight this war. I'm authorizing your modification to be standardized across all P-38 squadrons in my command. We're also sending technical teams to train mechanics at other bases." Smith felt something release in his chest. The weight he'd been carrying since March, the fear of court-martial, the responsibility for pilot lives, all of it shifted. His modification was no longer unauthorized. It was official Air Force policy. Kenny continued, "I'm also recommending you for the Legion of Merit. What you've accomplished here is remarkable." But Smith knew the truth. His modification wasn't remarkable. It was desperate. Born from watching friends die and refusing to accept that regulations mattered more than lives. He'd broken rules because the rules were killing pilots. Now those same rules were being rewritten to include what he'd discovered through trial and error. Over the next year, Smith's modification became standard procedure. Lockheed engineers studied his work, incorporated the principles into factory specifications for later P-38 models. The P-38J and P-38L variants included improved intercoolers and higher boost pressure limits, all based on Smith's unauthorized field modifications. The Army Air Forces never admitted where the improvements came from. Official histories credited Lockheed's engineering department. Smith didn't care. He wasn't chasing recognition. He was chasing survival rates, and those were climbing as fast as the modified P-38s he'd created. By the end of 1943, P-38 squadrons using Smith's modifications had achieved a 14-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters. Pilots who'd called Lightnings flying coffins now called them fork-tailed devils, with the kind of pride that comes from flying an aircraft you trust. Smith had given them that trust, and he'd done it with a wrench, some calculations, and the courage to ignore every regulation that said it couldn't be done. The media discovered Smith's story in October 1943, when a war correspondent named Ernie Pyle visited Port Moresby. Pyle interviewed pilots, heard stories about the mechanic who'd illegally modified their engines and saved their lives. He published a column titled, "The Sergeant Who Wouldn't Follow Orders." The story reached newspapers across America. Suddenly, Smith wasn't just a mechanic violating regulations. He was a hero who'd put pilot safety above paperwork. The War Department had a public relations problem. Officially, Smith's modifications had been unauthorized until June. Unofficially, those modifications had resulted in hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed and dozens of American pilots saved. They couldn't court-martial him without looking like bureaucrats who valued rules more than results. They couldn't promote him without admitting they'd been wrong about engine specifications, so they did something uniquely military. They transferred him. In December 1943, Smith received orders to Wright Field, Ohio, home of the Air Technical Service Command. His new assignment: consulting engineer for aircraft performance modifications. It was a promotion disguised as a lateral move. Smith spent the rest of the war working with Lockheed, Allison, and Republic Aviation, helping design improvements for P-38s, P-47s, and eventually P-51 Mustangs. His insights about boost pressure, intercooler efficiency, and combat power management influenced every American fighter developed after 1943. But he never forgot where those insights came from. A maintenance tent in New Guinea, watching pilots die because their aircraft couldn't perform. The war ended in August 1945. Smith returned to Iowa, bought a small farm, never talked much about his service. When neighbors asked about his medals, the Legion of Merit sitting in a drawer, he changed the subject. His daughter Margaret later said he believed the pilots deserved recognition, not the mechanic who just gave them tools to survive. But the pilots never forgot. In 1965, the P-38 National Association held its first reunion in Los Angeles. 200 former Lightning pilots attended. When they learned Smith was alive and living in Iowa, they invited him as guest of honor. He declined, said he didn't need recognition. They sent a delegation to his farm. Lieutenant Davis, now a retired colonel, and 3 other pilots whose lives Smith's modifications had saved. They arrived with a plaque. The inscription read, "To Sergeant Arthur Smith, who gave us wings when we needed them most." Smith died on November 12, 1982, at age 67. His funeral was small, family and neighbors, no military honor guard. But 14 former P-38 pilots made the trip to rural Iowa to pay respects to the mechanic who'd kept them alive when regulations said he shouldn't. One of his modified P-38s survived the war. After years in storage, it was restored and now flies at air shows across America. The engine still bears the modification plate Smith installed in 1943. When pilots fire up those Allison engines, push the throttles forward, and feel 1,600 horsepower respond, they're feeling what Smith created. Power that shouldn't exist, according to regulations, but saved lives because one man refused to accept that rules mattered more than survival. Today's fighter pilots learn about Smith's modifications in training, though few know his name. The principles he discovered, using combat conditions to temporarily exceed normal engine limits, became standard doctrine for every military aircraft developed since 1945. Afterburners, water injection, overboost systems, all descendants of Smith's illegal modification in a New Guinea maintenance tent. If the story about the sergeant who broke rules to save lives moved you, please hit that like button right now. It helps us share forgotten stories like this with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these memories from archives every day, making sure heroes like Arthur Smith don't disappear into silence. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let us know someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here, because these men changed the world and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping their stories alive.